Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of James Madison, and the focus is Jefferson's premiere. The year is 1800, it's an election year. John Adams, the incumbent president, has little chance as the Federalist Party is basically fractured, and Thomas Jefferson sees his ascendancy come true. He becomes the third president of the United States as the Democratic Republicans not only capture the presidency, but also the House and the Senate. It's a complete takeover of what Jefferson called a revolution, the revolution of 1800, as real a revolution in the principles of our government as that of 1776 was in its form, not affected indeed by the sword as that, but by the rational and peaceable instrument of reform, the suffrage of the people. Jefferson is now in power, and he is in power in large part thanks to New York. New York was the big flip from 1796 to 1800 that put him in power, and this was in part due to the fact that the New Yorkers and Jefferson and Madison, the Virginians, had found common cause. Not worrying about their differences, but realizing if they wanted power and to stop the monarchical tendencies of the current administration, they'd have to come together. And that's exactly what they did. This was different from what Madison had predicted would happen in Federalist 10, where he said in a large republic, you would have so many different factions and so many different interests that they'd kind of all cancel each other out. You wouldn't have consolidation of power. But they found out almost immediately that that was no path to power. And the path to power was by coming together, forming a large faction, forming a political party. And in this case, it worked. And they take over in the new capital of Washington. Well, Jefferson decides to completely change things as much as he could to dismantle all of the really formal stuff and monarchical tendencies, both in policy and form, associated with the previous administrations. And in that, he begins with replacing the cabinet, a completely new cabinet with James Madison as his number one right-hand man. Now, neither Washington or Adams actually had sort of a right hand in the cabinet, a number one go-to person, a prime minister, if you will, or a premier. But Madison really does play that role for Jefferson, not only in his formal capacity as Secretary of State, but also on domestic policy as well. They're all part of a very cohesive cabinet, one of the most cohesive and unified in American history. Most stayed all 8 years. There was very little dissension. You had Albert Gallatin at the Treasury Department, Henry Dearborn, the Secretary of War, Levi Lincoln, the Attorney General, Robert Smith at the Navy, and of course Madison as Secretary of State, all very much unified in their vision for the country, their policies, and their approach to governance. The first major accomplishment of the Jefferson administration is one in foreign policy, and it comes out of concern. Spain had property, 800,000 square miles of property right on the western border of the United States called the Louisiana Territory. In 1801, they ceded that territory back to France, and Napoleon, the emperor that Jefferson and Madison both loathed and feared, and they were concerned about what he might do on their western border. In particular, he thought they might cut off access to the Mississippi River or the mouth of New Orleans, which would effectively dissect the country, separating East and West. So they decided to ask their friend, their fellow Virginian, James Monroe, to go to France and try to at least buy New Orleans and maybe part of Florida as well, to see what kind of a deal they could put together. Well, he shows up, meets with Robert Livingston, the minister in France, and they have the great fortune that Napoleon not only wants to sell them New Orleans, he wants to sell all of Louisiana. He wants out of North America. He needs money for his wars in Europe. And what a boon to the United States to be able to buy all that land for only 15 million bucks. They sign on immediately. They send the treaty back to the United States, and everyone is pretty excited. They're going to get all this territory that eventually would house 13 new states. It would be this huge western buffer from a defensive standpoint. Mississippi River now would flow all within the borders of the United States for a cheap price. What's not to like? Well, the problem was Jefferson, the president, was convinced that it was unconstitutional. There was nothing in the Constitution that specifically authorized this kind of transaction. Now, Jefferson and Madison had been making their names attacking the prior administrations for going beyond the charter of the Constitution, abusing the necessary and proper clause, creating a despot like environment, tyrannical, if you will. And now they were thinking that maybe they would also just push the Constitution aside and have this major land acquisition go through the Congress anyway. They talked about an amendment to the Constitution. They even discussed what language that might have. But then they heard that Napoleon might be changing his mind, and all of a sudden, the end justified the means. It was okay now that they're in power to kind of wink a little bit toward the Constitution, say, yeah, maybe it's not exactly in there, but it's good enough. Let's go ahead and send the treaty through. They do, it's approved, and the Louisiana Purchase is a great boon to the United States. It was also a repudiation of their governing philosophy of sticking to the strict word and not overstepping the power of the federal government. But again, now that they're in power, they decided to change their minds. And again, it's a good boon for the United States, where the end, in their minds, justified the means. Well, now in the second term of Jefferson's administration, again with Madison still as his premier, as his Secretary of State, you've got war between Britain and France continuing, and it's really hurting U.S. shipping. They're both attacking American ships that were bound for each of their enemies. Hundreds of them were captured. And the question is, what is the United States going to do? Are they going to declare war? War against one, war against the other? Well, Jefferson and Madison are not in favor of war, and they're trying other methods to try to avoid war but still stick up for their country. And so they try an economic model. And in 1807, they get Congress to pass an Embargo Act, which basically shuts down all international trade from the United States. And the thought was, Britain and France need our trade, they'll see the wisdom of their ways, and they'll agree to a treaty that will stop them from attacking our ships. Well, it completely backfires. The American economy goes in the tank, about 75% of trade is actually shuttered, and it really doesn't bother the French or the British at all because they find other markets and other suppliers. So devastating to the United States, livelihoods are being shattered. So what does the Jefferson and Madison government do? They stick with their policy. Now, it was interesting if you think back 20 years to something James Madison had once said against the power of the federal government in making laws that the people might not like. He said at the time that attempts to enforce by legal sanctions acts obnoxious to so great a proportion of citizens tend to enervate the laws in general and to slacken the bands of society. If it be difficult to execute any law which is not generally deemed necessary or salutary, what must be the case where it is deemed invalid and dangerous? And what may be the effect of so striking an example of impotency in the government on its general authority? Well, they were finding out right then and there, because this is exactly what was going on with their embargo that was creating devastating effects across the United States economy. Their response? Double down. Looking to Congress to give them all the power possible to enforce these measures. They used the military to patrol the coast, to shut down any attempts to violate the embargo, put people in jail despite their protests. Now, this was perfectly legal. It was perfectly constitutional. It was a legitimate policy to try to avoid war. But again, this is Jefferson and Madison, who had been so careful in all of their rhetoric about making sure the federal government doesn't take actions to the detriment of their own people, which in this case, many of their own people thought was exactly what happened. But nevertheless, the embargo stays in place till the end of the Jefferson administration, even though this devastation to the American economy persists. Now, despite the unpopular embargo, the Democratic Republicans in general are still popular. There's not really an opposition party that has replaced the Federalists, and Madison is clearly the heir apparent. Jefferson had used him in his prime spot in the cabinet, and he said of Madison that he acquired a habit of self-possession, which placed at ready command the rich resources of his luminous and discriminating mind, and of his extensive information, and rendered him the first of every assembly afterwards, of which he became a member. With these consummate powers were united a pure and spotless virtue, which no calumny has ever attempted to sully. Well, with a nice endorsement like that, the party's still in power. No big surprise that Madison is elected the 4th president of the United States. He beats Charles Pinckney 122 to 47 in the Electoral College. And now the problems with Great Britain and France are all his. But that's the story for another day. That is James Madison as Jefferson's premier from the life of James Madison. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.